Well, U.S. President Joe Biden has invited 49 of 54 African leaders for a three-day summit that is scheduled for the 13th to the 15th of December. Those not invited are Burkina Faso, Guinea, Sudan, Mali, Eritrea, and Western Sahara. Now, the U.S. views this as an opportunity to strengthen ties with Africa. The summit itself gets underway after the Russia-Africa version failed to materialize. Now, to help us discuss the significance and the politics around the summit, I'm joined by Dr. Jason Musyoka, who's CEO of the Frontline Group. Dr. Musyoka, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for joining us on our program this morning. I want to get this issue around the countries left out of the list out of the way. We've got Sudan, Mali, Guinea, Eritrea, and the Western Sahara not invited to the Africa Summit. We also have the U.S. saying that they really want to engage in a mutually respectful manner with African leaders. By leaving out these countries, are they doing just that?
So thank you so much, Antokozo. So I think the African and U.S. relations has been quite an interesting one, going all the way back, particularly from around 2000, where there was quite a strong proposal around trade from the Clinton administration. But coming all the way, the one common thread has been the idea of good governance. Good governance is a theme that emerged around the 1990s and not surprisingly pushed from the U.S. itself, and there are various interpretations of what good governance really is. But that has been the central chord between the relations of the African Union states and the U.S. itself. Now, fast forward to currently, and the question around the exclusion of these countries that you've mentioned, Burkina Faso, Mali, Guinea, and Eritrea as well, Western Sahara, it's all around the theme on human rights. There is, of course, facts on the table, which is the fact that most of these countries, all of them that have been excluded, have experienced a form of coup. And therefore, the U.S. does not recognize the sitting administrations, the incumbent administrations as legitimate. So it's around the question of human rights. But this then becomes an issue around a broader question on whether the U.S. itself is willing to counter what China has been doing, which China does not really get involved or meddled into the human rights affairs and so on. So this is the one bone of contention between U.S. and African countries, where they really have been pushing back against meddling within the African Union member states, and particularly their domestic affairs.
Right. I mean, now that we've gotten the relations out of the way, I do want to talk about, motive. What's the motive behind this U.S.-Africa summit under, of course, the U.S. President Joe Biden's administration? Now, his senior advisor in the White House, Donna Banks, on Africa-related matters, has been quite transparent. She's been open to say that voting patterns, specifically at the United Nations when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, have been a concerning issue for the U.S. So, not mincing her words and saying that they're particularly concerned with the direction in which the African continent is taking when it comes to Western-based issues. What are your thoughts on her remarks, and whether or not that campaign is even going to be successful in convincing African countries not to be so ambiguous on their stance when it comes to what's happening in Russia and Ukraine?
Right. So I think this forms part, again, of a broader geopolitical debate on the power that the continent holds alongside other global powers. And as a bloc, traditionally, Africa has been very fragmented. You have Francophone countries, you have the Anglophone countries, and the politics and the trades are very much linked to colonial powers. So the fragmentation has been real. But what we have seen recently, particularly with the emergence of BRICS, with South Africa being admitted in 2011 to the BRICS region or bloc, what we've seen is a coming together of the collective, particularly of the African states, but also with the regions that are represented by Russia itself and China, India increasingly. So the southern bloc, so to speak, has been really forming, and this is largely, of course, driven by China. So China is behind the counterbalancing the traditional power that the West has had. Now, again, fast forward that to currently what we've seen, the U.S. has theoretically suggested that Africa is an important partner, and we've seen that kind of debate, Africa Rising. We've seen all of that kind of rhetoric emerging, but it's been largely theoretical until lately or recently, when you clearly can begin to see Africa's power on the global sphere, and the Ukraine-Russia conflict is one very good example where Africa voted as a bloc. And by the way, in terms of the United Nations vote allocation, Africa holds approximately 30%, almost about 28% of the global vote, of the UN vote. So as a bloc, when Africa voted in favor of Russia, or at least to abstain, that was very consequential for the U.S. to recognize this is not just theory. There is an emerging power, and yes, Africa might be a very small player as far as the global trade is concerned and so on, but the geopolitics and the geopolitical debates and the direction that the politics, global politics are taking, they do suggest that Africa actually has a major role to play. And the regions that neglect the role of Africa on the global geopolitics, they do so really at their own peril. Now, if you link that then with the trade and how the partnerships, particularly around economy and so on, China has been very, very vocal, and the U.S., I think, is only waking up now to the realization that Africa is not just a theoretical pawn, but it really is a major player, and I think we are likely to see this kind of contest emerging even into the future.
Dr. Musyoka, you talk about the power that Africa holds when it comes to geopolitics, and I wonder how helpful summits like these, the US-Africa Summit, the EU-Africa Summit, how helpful are these forums in terms of responding to the aspirations of the African people? There are significant calls being made by the likes of President Cyril Ramaphosa, for instance, calling for a seat at the table for Africa at the G20, the group of 20 economies, for instance, at the UN Security Council. Can these summits be more instrumental in sort of cementing that power that you were referring to, turning that geopolitical voting bloc into tangible results for the African people?
I think that's what you're likely to see moving into the future. Of course, there is a debate going on about Africa as the continent of the future, and the labels that are being associated with the continent beginning to be shed off as we see. But most critically, in Tokozo, it really is not so much about Africa. It is so much about the influence that China has had in Africa, and the U.S. Wanting to counterbalance or recounterbalance that, because the U.S. has had a tradition, of course, within the continent, particularly health spending has been huge for as far as the U.S. is concerned. China, though, has not had much of the model has been very different. It's not been the proposal and then the policy. China has been very pragmatic. And even beyond or before the Belt and Road Initiative that China has rolled out across the continent, and of course we've seen massive rollout of rail and road and power plants and so on. With that approach, that has just been formalized recently. Previously, you still have China's involvement on party level of training African parties, not meddling again into the domestic human rights issues, and yet having a major, in fact, in 2009, China overtook the U.S. as Africa's largest trade partner. And that gets to show you how U.S. is beginning to get nervous that this is likely to change the global game as far as the economy and trade is concerned. So all this to say, and Tokoza, that I think that Africa is not the intention is not so much to help Africa, I would say, in my assessment, But I think it is a matter of counterbalancing. And it's not just China and US, by the way. India is the third largest trade partner. We've seen also Japan with the African Union and Japan Summit. We've seen the European Union, UK as well. And this is all the efforts to try and make sure that none of these blocs are left behind when it comes to increasing their footprint. It's really a new form of colonialism, so to speak, but a much more sophisticated way of a Cold War, if you like, but much more fragmented.
Indeed. Well, how should African leaders be responding to this sort of new scramble for Africa? Calling to mind, obviously, the sort of conversations, the colonial conversations that were being had several centuries ago. How should African leaders be responding now? Because obviously the terms back then and now are vastly different, and we do hold some power. How do we ensure that we don't lose it all or give it all away and find ourselves in a similar position where our natural resources are being exploited for the development of other already developed and industrialized countries? Are our African leaders aware of what's happening, and are they responding acutely?
Perhaps not entirely from a collective point of view, and African leaders could preempt the outcomes. We have Africa Union 2063 agenda, and there are very specific objectives that the continent would like to achieve. We have AFCFTA, which is also very critical for achieving development. But I think that it is very critical to firstly also understand that in 2050, 1 in every 4 human beings will be African. So that's where the continent is going. And secondly, it is still the youngest continent. And what that really means is that by 2050, the natural resource will not so much be our natural resources, mineral reserves and oil and gas and so on, but it will be really labor force, young people who are much younger than the rest of the world, who will be really very useful for the global economy. So I think if we have that long-term perspective, if African leaders hold that long-term perspective on where the world is going and how the rest of the world is losing power, not just from a geopolitical point of view, but the fact that most of the countries, Europe in particular, are experiencing aging labor force, we are likely to begin creating opportunities for the young people. And I think that is what really we should be negotiating and using the current scramble for geopolitical influence to benefit young people through technologies and green energy and so on. I think that should really be how the leaders could preempt the outcomes in the next 40, 50 years.
All right. Well, Dr. Musyoka, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for joining us on our platform this morning and sharing your insights with us. Up next, we bring you the latest sports news and updates. Rachel Makura is standing by with those details.